So I'm joined by Lior, Paula, and Gideon from Worldward, which is a youth climate restoration organisation. But Gideon, can you first begin by telling us what Worldward is and what climate restoration is?
Yeah, so Worldward is an international youth climate restoration organisation. We're campaigning into climate restoration. We're a relatively new organisation, only really having got properly found our feet since the beginning of this year. So really exciting and growing. Climate restoration is essentially the idea that the way to combat the climate crisis is not just reaching net zero, which means cutting emissions, so you're not putting any more emissions into the atmosphere, so we're not making the problem worse. But it says that's not enough, because if you do that, the situation just still stays as bad as it is today, or whenever you stop emitting into the atmosphere. And today, millions of people are already suffering and dying because of climate change. And so just reaching net zero won't stop that. It will stay that bad. And in fact, because of some other physical, scientific things in the climate system, it might even get worse, even once we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So overall, even if we reach net zero, which is the height of current ambition, all the climate movements are talking about that. The Paris Agreement talks about that. And it depends on which the temperature target you need. But it doesn't matter, because all of them leads to people still suffering and dying for centuries or millennia to come. So restoration says we need to go beyond that. And we need to remove enough CO2 from the atmosphere to reverse the climate crisis, to actively make it better rather than stopping it being worse. And we need to remove that CO2 and safely store it, because that way we reverse the negative impacts we've done, not just stop and getting worse. And so we save millions of lives for millennia and centuries to come. And there's many, many different ways that you do this, but overall it has to be a combination of different removal techniques. So nature can play its role. Trees, wetlands, peat bogs, all these things can play a role. They can't do everything though. They've got some inherent problems in terms of land use and in terms of putting CO2 back into the atmosphere when forests burn, as we saw in Australia at the beginning of this year. Does not seem like the beginning of this year that happened, but it was. But also more technological solutions like removing CO2 from the atmosphere with kind of giant reverse fans, or removing CO2 from the atmosphere by crushing up rocks, those rocks reacting with CO2 and it's storing it in rocks. But basically, restoration is the only long-term solution to finding climate justice and to solving the climate crisis, because it doesn't just stop it getting worse, it actively makes it better as well. So there's two steps. There's net zero, stopping making it worse, which is the first step, but we want to go beyond that as well and remove CO2 from the atmosphere to reverse the climate crisis.
Thanks, Gideon. And Lior, could you tell us about specifically how Worldward are mobilising and going about achieving these huge aims?
Yeah, so Worldward is an organisation, as Gideon said, with the sole purpose of promoting climate restoration. And that means that all of our energy and our resources are poured into helping to bring about climate restoration. So Worldward is a entirely volunteer-led organisation, and it is also predominantly a youth-run organisation, so ranging from around 17 to in the 20s. Worldward is an international organisation. We're a non-governmental grassroots organisation, and we've now got volunteers from across the world, in fact now from every continent, which is really amazing because it enables us to have a diverse perspective on the impacts of climate change globally and also in approach to how we bring about climate restoration. This idea of a diverse approach is in fact fundamental to the way that Worldward functions. We are fundamentally a non-partisan organisation, which means that we don't hold a specific political approach or believe that there is one way to achieve climate restoration. We actually pride ourselves on the diversity of our volunteers and the different approaches that they bring, whether that perhaps be working on influencing communities to start small restoration projects, or really knuckling down on bringing climate restoration to the forefront of the political agenda and getting it out there to governments and working towards global, large-scale industrial efforts to bring about climate restoration. To many of you listening, this may in fact be the first time you've ever heard the phrase climate restoration. And that is in fact why Worldward is so important. At the moment, we are currently focusing on the educational side of climate restoration. So our efforts and the volunteer team that we have is currently putting the majority of our efforts into creating resources to help educate on climate restoration and also build relationships with other climate organisations and help to get climate restoration out onto the agenda of large climate movements and also onto the political agenda. From frequent webinars to educational videos to poetry to fictional literature and news articles. The volunteers of Worldward are committing their time and energy to educating the world on an individual level, on an organisational level and on a communal level about climate restoration and why the global undertaking of climate restoration is in fact a necessity. It's an imperative decision that the world must make. Our volunteer training programme is accessible to anyone. Anyone can volunteer for Worldward. And our volunteer training programme will educate you on what climate restoration is, how climate restoration is achieved, why net zero is not enough, and why climate restoration is a necessity. And by the end of the volunteer training programme, our volunteers feel that they've achieved an in-depth understanding of what climate restoration is and how it's achieved, to the point that they can then go out as individuals and with the organisation to promote climate restoration.
Thanks, Leo. And now, Paula, you're studying for a Bachelor in International Relations. And how do you think the nations will be able to work together to try and tackle this truly global problem? And also, how do you think these nations will be able to maintain economic growth whilst tackling these problems?
Okay, so since this problem is not only happening in a certain area of the world, the pollution migrates from one side to the other. It's honestly problematic that affects all of us, and that when helping a certain part of the world, you're also helping yourselves. So I think that this ideology and this point of view of actually helping other countries can really be powerful and can really unite country leaders to cooperating between each other. And because of it, I think that there can be lots of different funds, there can be lots of different projects that can work by cooperating between different countries. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean, oh yes, I'm going to give up my economic stability in order to help you. It could be simply, oh, okay, this scientific finding worked for us, maybe it can work for you. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, oh yes, I'm going to have to give you all this money in order for you to invest in your country. If not, this sense of South-South cooperation when talking about the global South, but also cooperation in general in this aspect, that you can send certain scientists to another part of the world in order for them to help to do these projects. And yeah, I think that when certain countries take the lead, it honestly helps other countries to believe that it's possible. So I think that that's a very important aspect. And then for the economic part of the question, I think that, yes, okay, lots of people talk about how lots of jobs are going to be lost when transitioning into other energy sources. But by creating these new energy sources and these new innovations, these new projects, it's going to create other jobs. So technically, you're not losing anything economically. Instead, you are being preventive towards these problematics that are just going to get worse. And you're just transitioning jobs into a new aspect. So instead of knowing how to take gas out of the ocean, you're going to learn how to build certain machinery that can help in a more renewable, more green energy sources.
Thank you. And now a question for all of you guys. What do you think that our listeners on a personal and individual level can do to try and bring about change and get involved?
I think the key way to get involved on an individual level, because this is such a systemic problem and it's about our global system, is to really get involved in helping to change that system. And I think I'll give a couple of examples, and I'm sure some of the others will. Firstly, it's educating yourself, educating others, because society and culture changes when we talk about things. If we start as when the student strikers and Extinction Rebellion got the idea of solving the climate crisis by getting net zero, not just in the way it used to be in the political sphere, but out into normal public, people started taking that we need to do the same with restoration. Then I'd say two more interesting ones is number one is get involved politically. If you're already involved politically or within a climate change organization, try to shift that to focusing on restoration. Because, you know, if you're doing mitigation, cutting emissions, as well as removals, that's the only way to really achieve climate justice. And if not, please get involved in any kind of organization, be it an international organization like Worldward or a very, very local organization as well. They work on amazing scales and there's tons out there. And then a third one is an interesting one, which is also think about your future as well. And how you deal with that. So this is actually, so for example, in the business world, something I'm actually going to disagree with Paola slightly on. She said that she thinks that restoration will mean that there won't be net jobs lost. I think actually there can be net jobs gained. I'm seeing tons of companies out there that are now starting up on restoration side to make loads of jobs. And there's loads of space there for people who are young, people about to go out into the workforce, to be trying to get involved with these restoration startups. So if you're interested in that side, on the sciencey or business side, then there's loads in that field as well about carrying out restorations and carrying out removals. So that's my kind of three things: educate, get involved politically, and get involved in the science and the business side of it.
Thanks, Gideon. And what do you think, Leo?
I think it is as simple as an individual, we all need to now actively step away from just being a person who cares about climate change and really use our time and our energy and our resources to help promote climate restoration. We need to direct climate restoration towards being the driving force of our economy, because climate restoration offers the opportunity to build an economy around green sustainable industry. Through removal and mitigation technology and projects, there is lots of opportunity for industry and work and employment and a flowing economy, which will in turn sustain us. And so I do think that if the initiative is taken within large industry and companies and on a governmental level and on an international cooperative level, I think there is the opportunity to turn this around while still maintaining economic freedom and economic success. However, it's what initiates that change that is so important. And that's why Worldward exists. Because currently climate restoration is not something that people talk about. It's not something that is being seriously considered, and it needs to be. It's the work that you can do as an individual, getting involved with an organisation such as Worldward to help promote climate restoration and initiate that international, governmental, large industrial change that we need to see. Without the action and campaigning of civil society, I think it seems highly unlikely that these changes will be made. And that's why the work of individuals and these small organisations is vital.
This is going to be our final question now. Just briefly, how hopeful are all of you that there's a political will for change to be made in the time that's required?
I don't know, if I'm honest. I really don't know. On the one hand, there's no technological or economic problems with that. We need restoration to carry out, to have a long-term economy, and it can create loads of economic benefits. So there's no reason not to do it. There's no human reason not to do it, because it will save millions of people's lives. But really, it's not up to us whether there becomes a political will. We're trying to form that political will. But fundamentally, it's up to everyone to try to actually push this forwards. It's up to the listeners to get involved in every way they can, like we said, or to vote, or to talk about it. To be honest, I'm not sure how hopeful I am. On the one hand, we could be heading for an apocalyptic world of 3 or 4 degrees, which is awful. On the other hand, if people muster the political will, if political leaders start taking this seriously, if countries start becoming leaders, if people and individuals get their voices heard and start saying we don't just want net zero, we want to go beyond that. We want to go beyond net zero and go for climate restoration, then we could end up with a world of restoration, which would be incredible. It will be much better, healthier, more hopeful, more prosperous than the world is today.
I think that sometimes we rely too much on the government, in the sense that we forget that the government is supposed to represent us, no matter what type of government we have. They're supposed to be fighting for what we want, and they're supposed to be Well, yes, exactly that, representing us. So I think that the government won't really care about climate change and climate restoration unless we care about it. I think that we can be hopeful, but we can only be hopeful if we show the world how important this is for us.
Thank you, Paula. And thank you to Gideon and thank you to Lior for joining us for this conversation. And I want to make sure all our listeners get in touch to tell us what they think needs to be done and the best method you can employ in order to create change and reverse the climate crisis.